They sat me at the end of the table, in the chair with the wobbly leg, the one nobody else wanted. And my son-in-law lifted his wine glass to the 22 guests in his glittering Harborview penthouse and said, "Let's all raise a glass to Walter, Grace's father, the man who taught her the value of $1 by never having more than a few of them at once." The laughter that followed was the polite, cruel kind, the laughter of people who don't know you and have already decided you don't matter. I smiled. I lifted my glass of water because I don't drink anymore, and I let them laugh. What none of them understood, what Damon Kessler in his $4,000 suit understood least of all, was that every square foot of the floor beneath their designer shoes, every beam holding up that penthouse, every dollar of the empire they were toasting sat on a foundation I owned. And I was about to pull it out from under him one quiet signature at a time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stay with me, because the way an old man dismantles a proud one is a slow and beautiful thing, and I want you to see every piece fall. My name is Walter Mercer. I am 65 years old. My wife Eleanor has been gone for 4 years now, and I still set 2 cups of coffee out some mornings before I remember. I live in the same modest brick house on Linden Street that Eleanor and I bought in 1986, the one with the crooked porch step I keep meaning to fix and never do. I drive a 15-year-old sedan the color of weak tea. I wear cardigans with worn elbows, and I read the newspaper the old way, folded in quarters at the kitchen table. If you passed me on the street, you would see a retired schoolteacher, or maybe a man who spent 40 years behind the counter of a hardware store. You would see someone easy to overlook. That is exactly what I have spent my whole life allowing people to see. Because the truth is different, and the truth is this. For 30 years I bought buildings. Quietly, patiently, one at a time, while other men chased flashier things. I never took a partner I didn't trust with my life. I never borrowed more than I could repay in a bad year. I never told a soul at church or at the diner what I did, because money makes people strange, and I had watched it make my own brother strange before it killed him young. So I let the world think I was nobody, and I collected deeds the way other men collect stamps. And by the time Eleanor got sick, I owned more of our little coastal city of Crescent Bay than anyone but the bank suspected. I owned it all through a holding company with a plain and forgettable name. Harbor Point Holdings. Remember that name. My son-in-law certainly will. I learned my caution the hard way, and I learned it young. I had a brother once, older than me by 5 years, named Thomas. Thomas was everything I was not. He was loud where I was quiet, bright where I was patient, the kind of man who walked into a room and made it his. When our father died and left us a small sum, Thomas took his half and multiplied it fast, in the flashy way that impresses everyone at first. He bought the big house on the hill. He drove the car everyone turned to look at. He told everyone at church exactly what he had and exactly what it was worth, because to Thomas money was not a tool, it was a costume, and a costume is no good unless people see you wearing it. And then the men who circle loud money the way sharks circle a wounded thing came for him, and they took it all, and they did it with smiles and signatures, and Thomas, who had built his whole self on the seeing of others, could not survive being seen as small. He died at 49 with nothing, and I have always believed it was not his heart that gave out but his pride. I stood at his grave, 29 years old, and I made myself 2 promises. I would never let anyone know what I had, and I would never, ever let money teach me to look down at a man who had less. Thomas broke both of those in his life, and it killed him. I have kept both for 36 years. And it is exactly because I kept them that a man like Damon could sit across from me for 11 years and never once suspect that the quiet fellow in the worn cardigan could end him with a letter. Eleanor knew, of course. Eleanor knew everything. She was the only person besides Harold who understood the full shape of what we had, and she treated it the way I did, as a private and slightly embarrassing fact, like a scar you don't show at dinner. We could have lived anywhere. We could have had the house on the hill that killed my brother. Eleanor chose the brick house on Linden Street with the crooked porch step, and she chose it precisely because it asked nothing of us and told the world nothing about us. "Let them wonder, Walter," she used to say. Or better yet, let them not wonder at all. She raised Grace to believe we were comfortable and careful and nothing more, and that was the greatest gift we ever gave our daughter, because it meant Grace grew up rich in the only currency that matters, which is the certainty that she was loved, and poor in the only one that corrupts, which is the belief that she was owed. It is a bitter thing that the man Grace married had grown up exactly the opposite way. rich in entitlement and starving for love, and spent his whole life trying to fill the second hole with the first thing, which never, ever works. Damon married my daughter Grace 11 years ago. I remember the first time she brought him home, how he shook my hand a beat too hard and looked past my shoulder at the smallness of my house, doing arithmetic behind his eyes. He was handsome in the way that photographs well and wears thin in person. He had ambition like a furnace, and back then I told myself ambition was not a sin, that a hungry young man could be a good man, that Grace's happiness was worth my patience. She loved him. That was enough for me. When a father sees the light his daughter carries for someone, he does not put it out because he has a bad feeling in his chest. He waits. He watches. He hopes to be proven wrong. In those early years, Damon had nothing but that furnace and a dream about the waterfront. Crescent Bay's harbor district was a ruin then, all rotting piers and shuttered canneries, the kind of place the city had given up on. But Damon walked me down there one gray afternoon, before he had any reason to be kind to me, and for 20 minutes the ambition in him turned into something almost like poetry. He pointed at a collapsing brick warehouse at the end of the pier, and he said, "Walter, imagine it. White tablecloths, candlelight on the water. People will drive 2 hours for a table here." And God help me, I could imagine it. I could see exactly what he saw. The difference between us was that I could also see the mortgage, the permits, the load-bearing walls, the 20 ways a dream like that eats a young man alive and spits out his bones. He couldn't get a loan. No bank in Crescent Bay would touch a 29-year-old with no collateral and a warehouse full of pigeons. He was ready to give up. I watched my daughter watch him deflate over dinner one night, watched her try to prop up a man whose furnace was going cold, and I made a decision that I would spend the next decade both proud of and haunted by. I bought the warehouse, quietly through Harbor Point Holdings, for a price that made the seller weep with relief. And then I did something Damon never knew, something Grace never knew, something I have told no living person until this very moment. I leased that building to my son-in-law for $1 a year. I let him believe he had found an investor, some faceless, generous holding company that saw promise in the harbor and offered him a sweetheart lease to get things started. He never asked too many questions because men like Damon believe good fortune is simply what they are owed. He signed the lease his lawyer skimmed and never read closely, the lease with the clause I had my attorney Harold write in plain small letters on page 9, the clause that said the lease renewed year to year at the sole and absolute discretion of the lessor, terminable upon 90 days written notice for any reason or no reason at all. Damon initialed that page without a glance. Why would he read it? He thought he'd charmed a fortune out of a stranger. He never dreamed the stranger was the quiet old man he'd already decided to look down on. That warehouse became the Crescent Room. And Damon was right. Damn him, he was right about all of it. People did drive 2 hours for a table. Candlelight did dance on the black water of the harbor. Within 3 years, it was the most celebrated restaurant on that stretch of coast. And Damon Kessler's face was in the regional magazines. And the harbor district began to bloom around his success the way districts do. He opened a second restaurant, then a boutique hotel, then an events company, a catering arm, a whole hospitality group with his name on the letterhead in gold. Kessler Hospitality Group. And every dollar of it, every loan he took to expand, every line of credit the banks finally lined up to offer him, rested on one thing: the Crescent Room, his crown jewel, his flagship, the building I owned and leased to him for the price of a cup of coffee, on a lease I could end with a letter. I never used that power, not once in 11 years. I want you to understand that. I am not telling you this story as a man who set a trap and waited. I set no trap. I helped him because I loved my daughter and because a small part of me, the part that once stood on a rotting pier and saw candlelight where there were only pigeons, wanted to see the dream stand. I paid for their wedding and let his family take the credit. I paid, quietly, for Grace's difficult first pregnancy when their insurance balked, and let them think a hospital charity had covered it. When my granddaughter Ellie was born 6 years ago, I held her in the hospital hallway at 3 in the morning and I wept, and I promised her sleeping face that her grandfather would always be the wall between her and the cold. I meant it as a feeling. I did not yet know I would mean it as a plan. The years curdled Damon slowly, the way success curdles a certain kind of man. Money did not make him generous. It made him hungry in a meaner way. The furnace that once burned for a dream began to burn for status, for the envy of other men, for a version of himself that could never afford to be seen next to a father-in-law in a cardigan with worn elbows. I noticed the small cruelties first. He stopped introducing me at parties. Then he started introducing me wrong as Grace's dad. He was in retail, I think. With a little laugh, he moved Eleanor's memorial dinner, the one Grace wanted, to a Tuesday because a client wanted his weekend. He let Ellie call his own parents by warm names and taught her, without ever saying so, that Grandpa Walter was the one you were a little embarrassed by. I could give you 100 of these, and I am afraid I remember all of them, the way you remember every stone in a shoe you walked a long road in. There was the Christmas he forgot to set a place for me until Grace noticed and quietly pulled a chair from the study, and the way he watched her do it with a small satisfaction he thought I couldn't see. There was the time Ellie, 4 years old, drew me a picture of the two of us fishing, a thing we had never done because Damon had never once allowed it, and Damon took the drawing and said, "That's not real, sweetheart, Grandpa doesn't have a boat." And I watched a child learn in real time that the wanting of a thing was somehow shameful. There was the birthday, my 63rd, when they were 40 minutes late to my own small dinner because Damon had double-booked a golf game, and when they finally arrived he spent the meal on his phone, and Grace apologized for him with her eyes across the table the whole night. I never said a word about any of it. Not one word. Because I had made a promise at my brother's grave, and because I had learned that a man who defends his own dignity in front of his daughter only teaches her that dignity is a thing that must be defended, when what I wanted her to know is that real dignity cannot be touched by a man like Damon at all. It simply sits at the end of the table and eats its dinner and loves its grandchild and waits. But there was a cost to all that swallowing, and the cost was not mine. The cost was Grace. Because every insult I absorbed in silence, she absorbed too, and unlike me she had not made peace with it. And unlike me she could not see the ground beneath her feet. I watched my daughter, year by year, learn to make herself smaller. I watched her laugh at things that weren't funny because laughing was safer. I watched her stop finishing sentences when he entered a room. I watched the bright, stubborn, funny girl Eleanor and I had raised turn down her own volume, dim her own light, until she was a woman who apologized for her father with her eyes because she had learned it was unsafe to apologize with her mouth. And that, more than any insult to me, was the thing I could not forgive, though I did not yet know how thoroughly I would be given the chance not to. There was one afternoon, maybe 2 months before the phone call changed everything, when I tried. I want you to know that I tried, in the gentle and clumsy way a father tries, because I have replayed that afternoon 1,000 times and wondered whether a braver man would have said more. Grace had come by the house alone, a rare thing, to drop off some of Eleanor's old recipe cards she'd finally sorted through. We sat at my kitchen table and had coffee, and for a little while she was my Grace again, unguarded, laughing at a story about her mother. And then I said carefully, "The way you step onto ice you're not sure will hold. Sweetheart, are you happy?" She went still, and then she smiled too quickly and said, "Of course, Dad. Why would you ask that?" And I said, "Because you got quiet. Somewhere along the way you got quiet." And I remember a girl who never once in her life was quiet. I watched her face do something complicated, watched the truth rise almost to the surface and then get pushed back down by 11 years of training. "Damon's under a lot of pressure with the expansion," she said. "That's all. He doesn't mean anything by it. You don't know him like I do, Dad. Underneath it all he's—" And she stopped, because even she couldn't finish the sentence, and we both heard the silence where the end of it should have been. I reached across the table and put my old hand over hers and I said, "Grace, if you ever need me, for anything, at any hour, you call me, and I will be there before the phone stops ringing, and there is nothing on this earth that I could not handle for you. Do you understand me?" And she laughed a small, sad laugh and said, "Dad, you're sweet, but I'm fine. And besides," and here she patted my hand as if I were the child, "it's not like you can fix everything. You're not exactly a man of means." I smiled and let her believe it. It was the last time she would ever be able to say that to me and mean it. 2 months later I would prove, more thoroughly than she could imagine, exactly how wrong she was, and I would give anything for it not to have taken what it took to prove it. That conversation haunts me for a reason you might not expect. It is not that I failed to warn her. It is that I understood, watching her defend him with a truth she no longer believed, that Damon had done something worse than steal from my daughter. He had stolen her from herself. He had made her the lawyer for her own diminishment. And I drove myself half mad in the weeks after, wondering how a father is supposed to save a daughter who has been taught to guard the door of her own cage. The answer, when it came, was not one I would have chosen. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the dinner where they would sit me at the broken chair. I had driven over to their penthouse to drop off a booster seat Grace had left at my house after Sunday lunch. I had a key, the key Grace insisted I keep for emergencies. The key Damon didn't know I had. I let myself into the lobby, rode the private elevator up, and I was reaching for the door when I heard his voice through it, low and easy and pleased with itself. The voice of a man who thinks he is alone. I should have knocked. I don't know why I didn't. Call it the instinct of an old man who has learned that the truth usually arrives through a door left slightly ajar. I stood there with a child's booster seat in my hands and I listened, and my whole understanding of the situation I was in came apart and reassembled itself into something far uglier and far more dangerous. He was on the phone, and he was laughing. No, it's handled, he said. The Aspen place closes next month. It's in the LLC. She'll never find it. Her name's on nothing that matters. A pause. Then, softer, the way a man talks to a woman who is not his wife. Soon. Promise. After the Harbor Point deal funds, I move everything and then I file. Clean break. She keeps the house, which is mortgaged to the ceiling anyway, and I keep the group. Another pause, and then the sentence that turned the blood in me to something cold and slow and permanent. Grace was a good investment when I had nothing. Sentimental value, sure. But you don't run a business on sentiment, baby. She's served her purpose. I did not burst through that door. I want to tell you I wanted to, that some fire rose up in me and it took everything to hold it down, and that would be a lie. What rose up in me was not fire. It was ice. It was the oldest and steadiest thing I have, the part of me that bought buildings for 30 years while other men chased flash, the part of me that can stand at the end of a table and smile while people laugh. I set the booster seat down silently outside their door. I rode the elevator back down. I sat in my weak tea sedan in their gleaming parking structure for a long time, my hands perfectly still on the wheel, and I did the arithmetic. Not the arithmetic of rage. The arithmetic of a man who owns the ground his enemy is standing on. Because here is what Damon had just told me, without knowing he was telling me anything. He was going to divorce my daughter. He had been hiding money for months, maybe years, in an LLC and an Aspen property she didn't know existed. He intended to strip her to nothing, leave her holding a mortgaged house, and walk away with the entire hospitality group. And the linchpin of his whole plan, the thing he was waiting on before he pulled the trigger, was something he called the Harbor Point deal. My blood, when I heard those two words, did something I cannot fully describe. Because Harbor Point was my company, and I had no deal with Damon Kessler. I did not sleep that night. I sat in Eleanor's chair by the window, the one I've never been able to give away, and I watched the streetlight on Linden Street until it went gray with dawn. And somewhere in the middle of that long dark, I did the thing I always do when the weight is too much for one man to carry. I went to Eleanor. She's buried in the old cemetery on the hill above the harbor, where you can see the water through the oaks. I got there just as the sun came up, and I sat on the cold grass beside her stone the way I've done 100 mornings since she left me, and I told her everything. I told her what our son-in-law had said about our daughter. I told her the words, the exact words, "She's served her purpose." And I heard how they sounded said out loud in the quiet, and I put my face in my hands. And then I asked her what I had really come to ask, which was not what to do, because I already knew what I could do. I asked her whether I was allowed to. "Nell," I said, "I can end him. I can take it all back, everything, the building, the money, the whole life he built on our land. And I can do it so cleanly that no court will ever untangle it. But if I do, I become the thing I promised at Thomas's grave I would never be. I become a man who used what he had to break another man. Tell me that isn't what this is. Tell me I'm still the man you married." I sat there a long time in the cold, and of course she didn't answer. She never does. But sitting in her quiet, I found the answer that had been mine all along. It came to me in her voice, the way the truest things always do. "Walter," she said, "you promised you'd never use what you have to feel bigger than another man. You never promised you wouldn't use it to keep a smaller one from throwing your daughter off a roof. Those are not the same promise. And a man who won't tell the difference between them isn't humble. He's just a coward who's found a noble word for it." I stood up from her grave, a different man than the one who'd knelt down. Not a harder man, clearer one. Because Eleanor was right, the way she was almost always right. There is a kind of gentleness that is really just fear wearing its Sunday clothes, a refusal to act dressed up as a refusal to harm. I had spent a lifetime being underestimated and calling it wisdom, being silent and calling it strength, and most of the time it truly was. But there is a moment when silence stops protecting the people you love and starts protecting only the person who is hurting them. And a man who cannot feel the exact instant that line is crossed has no business calling himself anyone's father. I had felt the line cross the moment I heard the words through that door. Everything after was not vengeance. It was a wall, made of everything I had spent 30 quiet years building, put finally between my daughter and the cold. And then, because I have learned that the difference between a problem and a plan is only the number of facts you have, I drove home and I called Harold. Harold Beckman has been my attorney for 31 years. He is 73, sharp as a fresh blade, and he is one of exactly 2 people alive who know the full extent of what Harbor Point Holdings owns. He answered on the second ring because Harold does not sleep much anymore either. "Walter," he said, "it's late for you." I told him I needed to see him first thing in the morning, that I needed him to pull every document connected to Damon Kessler and Kessler Hospitality Group, the lease, the guarantees, all of it. There was a silence on the line, the particular silence of an old friend recalculating. "Walter," he said carefully, "what did the boy do?" And I told him. And when I finished, there was a longer silence, and then Harold said something I will not forget. He said, "Well, he built his whole house on your land, and he never once read the deed." I said, "No, Harold, he didn't." And Harold said, "Then let's find out exactly how far the walls will fall when you decide to move them." I met Harold at 8 the next morning in his cramped office above the old savings bank. The office he refuses to leave for anything nicer because, he says, cheap rent is the only kind of loyalty a landlord respects. He had files spread across his desk like a surgeon's instruments. And over the next 3 hours, Harold walked me through exactly what I held. And it was more, far more, than even I had remembered. 11 years of not looking too closely at a thing I never intended to use had let me forget how completely I owned my son-in-law. The lease was the least of it, though the lease alone would have been enough. 90 days' notice, my sole discretion, and the Crescent Room ceased to exist. But there was more. When Damon expanded to his second restaurant, back when the bank still didn't quite trust him, he had needed a personal guarantor to secure the construction loan. He had come to Grace, and Grace had come to me, and I had signed quietly as a guarantor through one of my entities, on the condition that a promissory note be executed for the additional cash I fronted directly, for $100,000. Damon had waved it off as family money, and over the years treated it as forgiven. It was not forgiven. Harold had the note. It was demandable, payable on 90 days' notice, and it had been accruing interest at a modest, patient, entirely legal rate for 8 years. The balance was now just over $640,000. And there was the third thing, the thing that made Harold take off his glasses and rub the bridge of his nose. The Harbor Point deal. Damon, it turned out, had spent the last several months in negotiations to sell a majority stake in Kessler Hospitality Group to an out-of-state investment firm, a deal that would have funded, in his words, and put millions of liquid dollars into that hidden LLC of his before he filed for divorce. And the entire valuation of that deal, the whole basis on which those investors were offering him millions, rested on one asset presented as the jewel of the group: the Crescent Room, its brand, its location, its revenue, presented in the offering documents Harold's contact had quietly glimpsed as a secure, long-term asset of the company. Damon was selling investors a building he did not own, on a lease he had never read, from a landlord he had spent 11 years mocking at dinner parties. I sat in that cramped office for a long moment. The morning light came in dusty through the old blinds. And I understood that I was holding not a weapon but a whole armory, and that the question was no longer whether I could stop Damon Kessler. The question was how to bring the entire structure down in a way that buried him completely and left my daughter and my granddaughter standing untouched in the clear. Rage would have swung wildly. Rage would have hurt Grace. I did not have rage. I had 30 years of buying buildings, and I had a granddaughter's sleeping face I'd made a promise to, and I had time. 90 days of it, to be exact. But before I moved a single stone, I made myself do the hardest thing, which was to be sure. A man overhears one phone call through one door and his heart tells him a whole story. And the heart is a poor lawyer. If I was going to end my daughter's marriage and a man's entire livelihood, I would not do it on the strength of a thing I thought I heard while holding a booster seat. I would do it on facts, verified, the way I have done every important thing in my life. So I did not act for 2 weeks. 2 of the longest weeks I have ever lived. Sitting across the dinner table from Damon at Sunday lunch, passing him the potatoes, listening to him talk about his big deal on the horizon, and saying nothing, while Harold and I quietly confirmed each thing in turn. The Aspen property was real. Harold's title search found it inside a Delaware LLC whose sole member was a shell whose sole member was Damon, 3 layers deep. Exactly the kind of nesting a man builds when he intends to hide a thing from a wife's attorney. The hidden accounts were real. They left footprints, as money always does, in the vendor payments and the transfers that a careful eye can follow. And the woman was real. I did not hire anyone to follow anyone. I want you to know that. I am not a man who puts a camera on his own daughter's marriage. But I did not have to. A friend of Grace's, a kind woman named Paula who had never trusted Damon, had seen him twice at a restaurant 2 towns over with a woman who was not his wife, and had agonized for months over whether to say anything. And when I asked her one careful question over coffee, the whole thing came out of her in a rush of relief. The woman's name was Sabrina. She worked at the very investment firm that was about to fund his deal. Everything he had said through that door was true. There was no doubt left to hide behind. There was only the decision, and I had already made it on a cold hillside beside Eleanor's grave. There was one more person I needed, and calling him was the moment the plan stopped being a private grief and became a moving thing in the world. Gene Halloran and I have known each other for 40 years. Gene is a senior man at the bank that holds most of Damon's paper, the same bank that, back when it wouldn't return a young dreamer's calls, quietly did business with Harbor Point Holdings for 3 decades because Harbor Point always paid and never lied. Gene owes me nothing and I owe him nothing. Ours is the rarer thing, a friendship with no debts in it. I took him to lunch at a diner where no one knew either of us, and I did not ask him to do anything improper because Gene wouldn't and I wouldn't ask. I simply told him that a formal notice was about to be served on the lease securing a certain flagship property, and that as a friend I thought he might want to be looking closely at the file it touched before he read about it in a memo. Gene set down his fork. He looked at me for a long moment, the way a man looks at a card he suspected all along was in your hand. "Walter," he said slowly, "how long have you owned the Kessler building?" And I said, "Since it was pigeons, Gene." And Gene laughed, one short surprised laugh, and then he stopped laughing because he was already doing the arithmetic that bankers do, the arithmetic of what happens to a man's whole line of credit when the ground under his crown jewel is pulled. "God help him," Gene said quietly. And I said, "God can do as he likes. I'm handling the rest. Let me tell you the first thing I did, because it tells you everything about the difference between me and the man who would soon be begging in my kitchen. I did not touch Damon. Not yet. The first thing I did was protect Grace. I had Harold begin, that very morning, drawing up an irrevocable trust in my granddaughter Ellie's name, funded quietly from Harbor Point, a trust that would put a roof and an education and a floor beneath her feet that no divorce, no LLC, no hidden Aspen chalet could ever touch. And I began, just as quietly, to arrange things so that when the walls came down, my daughter would find herself not in the rubble but already standing on solid ground she didn't yet know I'd poured. A man protects the people he loves before he punishes the man who threatened them. Anyone who does it in the other order was never really protecting anyone. He was just angry and calling it love. Now, here is where I have to tell you about the dinner. Because the dinner happened right in the middle of all this. Right in the quiet 90-day window while Harold and I moved money and drafted documents and I said nothing, absolutely nothing, and let Damon believe the sun rose and set for his benefit. Grace called me on a Wednesday and asked, in the careful voice she'd started using, whether I might come to a dinner Damon was throwing to celebrate their 11th anniversary and, not incidentally, to impress the very investors who were about to fund his escape. "He wants you there, Dad," she said, and I heard the lie in it, heard how badly she needed it to be true, and I said of course I'd come, sweetheart, I wouldn't miss it, and I meant that too, though not the way she hoped. I wore my good cardigan, not to fit in, to be seen exactly as they wished to see me one last time before everything changed. I brought a bottle of good wine I knew Damon would set aside for something better, and I brought Ellie a small wooden bird I'd carved myself over 3 evenings at my kitchen table, the way my own father had taught me. And I walked into that glittering penthouse full of investors and consultants and people with very white teeth. And Damon looked at my cardigan and my carved bird and my supermarket wine, and something crossed his face, a flicker of a decision. The decision a proud man makes when he wants to demonstrate his height by measuring it against someone he's sure is smaller. They sat me at the end of the table, in the chair with the wobbly leg. Grace tried to move me up and Damon said smoothly, so the guests would hear it as charm, "No, no, let Walter have the end. He likes it quiet, don't you, Walter?" And I said, "I do, Damon. I like to see the whole table from down here." He didn't hear the second sentence. Men like Damon never hear the second sentence. And then, when the entrees came and the wine flowed, and one of the investors asked politely what I did for a living, Damon answered for me. He lifted his glass and gave the toast I told you about at the start. "Let's raise a glass to Walter, Grace's father, the man who taught her the value of $1 by never having more than a few of them at once." And the beautiful people laughed their beautiful cruel laugh. I watched my daughter's face during that toast. That is the part one will never forgive, and I want you, whoever you are, listening to an old man's voice, I want you to hold this moment with me. I did not care about the insult to me. I have been underestimated my whole life. It is, in fact, the single greatest advantage a man can cultivate. But I watched Grace's face as her husband made a punchline of her father in front of the people whose respect she'd been taught to crave. And I watched her laugh too, a half-second late, because she had learned that laughing was safer than defending. And I understood that Damon had not only planned to discard my daughter. He had already, over 11 slow years, taught her to make herself smaller so that he could feel large. He had been draining her long before he ever touched the accounts. So I smiled, and I raised my glass of water, and I said in my quiet way, loud enough only for the near end of the table, "To Grace, who is worth more than every person in this room combined, and who will understand what that means very soon." Damon didn't catch it, but one person did. An older woman, one of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Osei, who I would later learn was the deal's lead partner, looked down the table at me with sudden, careful attention, the way one careful person recognizes another. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she looked at Damon, laughing at the head of his table, and something in her face cooled by a single degree. File that away. It matters later. I ate my dinner at the broken chair. I gave Ellie the wooden bird, and she loved it. The way children love the thing made by hand over the thing bought with a card. And Damon watched her love it with a small, tight expression he couldn't quite hide. And when the evening ended, I kissed my daughter's cheek and I shook my son-in-law's hand. That too-hard handshake he'd greeted me with 11 years before, and I said, "Thank you for having me, Damon. It was a wonderful evening. I'll never forget it." He smiled his magazine smile and said, "Anytime, Walter, anytime." He had no idea he'd just spent his last evening as a wealthy man in a room that respected him. The next morning I began. "I want to be honest with you about how it felt, because I think the honest thing is more useful to you than the satisfying thing. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like surgery. There is a moment when you finally move against someone who has wronged the people you love, when the anger you expected to feel simply isn't there, and in its place is a terrible, steady clarity, and a grief for the man he might have been. I had stood on a pier with that boy once and watched him see candlelight where there were only pigeons. Some part of me was burying that boy now, and I knew it, and I did it anyway, because that boy was long dead and the man who wore his face was reaching for my daughter's throat. The first letter went out on a Monday. Harold delivered it himself by hand to the offices of Kessler Hospitality Group, in a plain envelope with the return address of Harbor Point Holdings. It was a formal notice of non-renewal of the lease on the property known as the Crescent Room, effective at the end of the 90-day notice period. In accordance with the terms Damon had initialed on page 9 and never read. It was polite. It was legal. It was final. And it was signed by an authorized officer of Harbor Point Holdings, a signature Damon would not recognize, because Harold signs on behalf of the company and my name appears on nothing a casual eye would catch. I have often wondered what that morning was like for him. The confusion first, surely. Harbor Point? Non-renewal? There must be a mistake. A call to his lawyer, the lawyer scrambling to find the lease. Reading page 9 for the first time in 11 years. The slow horror as he realized the sweetheart deal he'd bragged about for a decade had a leash on it, and someone he'd never met was holding the other end. And then the second letter arrived 2 days later, the demand for payment in full of the promissory note, $640,000 in interest 90 days, also from Harbor Point Holdings, also signed by a stranger. And I imagine that was the morning Damon Kessler first felt the floor move under him and could not understand who was moving it. He spent the next 2 weeks hunting the wrong man. This is the part that would be funny if it weren't so sad. Damon threw everything he had into discovering who was behind Harbor Point Holdings, and it never once, not for a single second, occurred to him to look at me. He had his lawyer file requests, chase the shell, call in favors, and the shell was built the way Harold builds things, which is to say patiently and completely, and every road led to a registered agent's office and a locked door. Damon became convinced it was a rival. He accused a competitor across town of secretly buying up his lease to steal his business, and made an enemy of a decent man who had nothing to do with any of it. He accused his own second-in-command of leaking to some hidden buyer, and fired a loyal woman who had worked for him for 9 years and did not deserve it. He tore through his own house looking for the traitor, and the traitor was never in the house. The traitor was eating Sunday potatoes at the end of his table, in the cardigan with the worn elbows, saying nothing. There was one moment, and only one, when it nearly came apart. Grace called me, upset, 3 days after the second letter. Damon was frantic, she said. The business was in some kind of trouble. Some landlord company was squeezing him. Did I, with my careful nature, know anything about how these holding companies worked? Could I look at a letter he'd gotten and tell him if it was legitimate? And she said she'd take a photo of it and send it to me. My heart, I will admit, stopped for a moment. Because if Grace sent me a photograph of Harold's letter, and if she was standing next to Damon when I answered, one wrong flicker in my voice could unravel everything before Ellie's trust was fully funded and before Grace was safe. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I made my voice into the voice of a mildly interested old man who is good with paperwork. Of course, sweetheart, I said. Send it along. I'll take a look. Though I doubt an old fellow like me will make much of a fancy company's legal letter. She sent it. I looked at Harold's letter on my own phone screen, my own instructions turned into a weapon, and I told my daughter gently that it looked like a real and serious notice, and that Damon should take it to a good lawyer, and that these things were usually about money and could usually be solved with money if one had it. Every word true. Not one word revealing. Grace thanked me, relieved to have consulted her careful father, and hung up, and never knew that she had just shown me my own signature and asked me whether it was real. I sat down at my table after that call and my hands were not quite steady. It is one thing to move against a man. It is another to do it while looking your own daughter in the eye. I do not recommend it, but I would do it again. The banks felt it before he did, really. That is the thing about a man who has borrowed against everything. He does not fall alone or slowly. He falls the way a marionette falls when you cut the strings all at once. When word reached his primary lender, through the ordinary channels these things travel, that the flagship location of Kessler Hospitality Group had received a notice of non-renewal, that the crown jewel securing his lines of credit would cease to exist in 90 days, the lender did what lenders do. They got nervous. They pulled a credit line. They called a loan for review. And the out-of-state investment firm, the one about to fund Damon's whole escape, the one led by a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Osei who had already cooled by one careful degree at his dinner table, did the most dangerous thing of all. They paused the deal to conduct additional due diligence. And in that pause, they discovered what I had known for weeks. Damon Kessler had presented them a building he did not own, as a secured long-term asset, in a set of documents that now looked less like optimism and more like fraud. If you have followed this story to here, Let me stop and ask you something because I have carried this question for a long time and I would like to know what you would have done. If you discovered that your child's spouse was secretly planning to strip them of everything and cast them out, and you held in your hands the power to destroy that person completely and quietly and legally, would you use it? All of it? Or would you show a mercy you were not shown? Tell me in the comments where you would draw the line because I drew mine, and I am still not certain I drew it in the right place. Stay with me. You haven't seen where I drew it yet. Damon came to me 11 days after the first letter. Not because he knew, not yet, but because he had run out of other doors to knock on. He arrived at my crooked little house on Linden Street on a Saturday morning, and I watched him get out of his car, and I saw that something in him was already broken, some certainty that had held his shoulders up for 11 years. He knocked, and I let him stand there a moment, and then I opened the door and said, "Damon, this is a surprise. Come in, I'll put on coffee." And he came into my small kitchen, the kitchen where I carve birds and read the paper folded in quarters, and he sat at my table, and for the first time in 11 years my son-in-law looked at me like I was a person who might be able to help him. The irony of it could have choked a lesser man. I just poured the coffee. He told me a version of the truth. Not the real truth, of course. He told me the truth a proud man tells when he needs something. He said the business was hitting some turbulence. Some issue with the landlord on the harbor property, some old investment firm playing hardball, a cash flow squeeze. He said he might need help, that Grace had mentioned I'd done okay for myself over the years, that maybe I could co-sign something or make a call, or he said growing smaller in the chair that maybe I knew people. I let him talk. I let him ask. I let him, this man who had toasted my poverty to a table full of strangers 11 days before, sit in my kitchen and ask the poor old fool for a rescue. And when he was done, I set down my coffee, and I said the thing I had been saving. I said, "Damon, I want to make sure I understand. You need someone to save the Crescent Room, to get the landlord to renew the lease, to make Harbor Point Holdings change its mind." He said, yes, exactly. Did I know anyone at Harbor Point? Was it a local outfit? Could a personal appeal maybe work? And I looked at my son-in-law across the table my own father built, and I said very quietly, "I'm the landlord, Damon. I've been the landlord for 11 years. Harbor Point Holdings is me. The $1 a year lease was me. The $400,000 you called family money was me. The building you toasted, the jewel you built your whole life on, the ground under every dollar you have, has been mine since the day it was a warehouse full of pigeons and you couldn't get a bank in this town to return your calls. I own the floor you've been standing on to look down at me, and I am taking it back. I have thought a great deal about the silence that followed. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, which is a very long time in a small kitchen. I watched the arithmetic run behind his eyes, the same arithmetic he'd run at my shoulder 11 years before, only now every number came up ruin. I watched him understand the dinner, the toast, the broken chair, the whole 11 years of small cruelties, understood by both of us at last from the far end of the table where I'd been sitting the whole time, seeing everything, saying nothing, waiting. And then, because he was who he was, the fear turned to something worse. He got angry. He stood up so fast the chair fell. He called me names I won't repeat, said I'd set a trap, said I'd been planning this, said I was a snake who'd hidden in the grass for 11 years waiting to strike at him. And this is the part one want you to hear clearly, because it is the truest thing I know. I said, "No, Damon. I set no trap. I helped you because I loved my daughter, and for 11 years I never once used what I held, and I would have died without ever using it, and let you inherit the whole thing free and clear when I was gone if you had only been decent to her. This isn't a trap I set. This is a floor I've decided to stop holding up. You're the one who chose to stand on it while you planned to throw her off the roof." His face changed when I said that last part, because he understood then that I knew, not just about the money, about Aspen, about the LLC, about the phone call and the woman and the words, "She's served her purpose." He understood that the quiet old man at the end of the table had heard everything, and had been moving against him for weeks, and that there was no rescue coming, because the man he'd come to beg was the storm itself. He tried, then, the last thing men like him have left when the money is gone. He tried to make it about love. He sat back down in the fallen chair, which he'd righted, and he put his face in his hands, and when he looked up his eyes were wet and I could not tell you even now how much of it was real. "Walter," he said, "I made mistakes. I know I did. But I love Grace. I've always loved Grace. Whatever you think you heard, whatever this is about, don't punish her to get at me. Think about Ellie. You'd be tearing apart your own granddaughter's family. And I want you to notice what he did there because it is the oldest move in the book, and it nearly works every time. He reached for the very people he had been planning to discard, and he held them up in front of himself like a shield. He had spent 11 years making Grace small, and he was now, in my kitchen, prepared to use her as his last defense. And that was the moment the last of my grief for the boy on the pier finally died, and something very calm took its place. I said, "Damon, I want to tell you what I heard, so we can stop pretending. I heard you tell a woman named Sabrina that Grace was a good investment when you had nothing, and that she served her purpose. I heard you say you'd move everything to the LLC after the Harbor Point deal funded, and then file and leave her the mortgaged house. I heard you call my daughter, the mother of your child, a card that had outlived its use." The color left his face in a single wave, from the top down, the way water leaves a glass. "So don't sit in my kitchen and tell me not to tear apart Ellie's family," I said. "You did that months ago in a phone call you thought no one heard. All I'm doing is making sure that when the family you already broke comes apart, my daughter and my granddaughter are standing on the solid side of the crack, and you're standing on the side that falls. That's not me destroying your family, Damon. That's me refusing to let you destroy mine." He was quiet for a long time after that. And then, because a cornered man always shows you his true face at the very end, the pleading dropped away and what was underneath it came out, and it was ugly, and I was almost grateful for it because it made the rest easy. "You think you've won," he said, low and vicious now, all the wet gone from his eyes. "You think a sad old man in a dead wife's cardigan has won something. You've got money. Fine. You've always had money and you sat on it like a coward while I actually built something, while I made something people wanted. I turned a pile of pigeon-filthy bricks into the best restaurant on this coast, and you just owned the dirt. Any fool can own dirt." And I looked at my son-in-law and I felt, God help me, a flicker of the old fondness, because there at the very end was the boy from the pier, the furnace, the poetry, the man who really had seen candlelight where there were only pigeons. "You're right," I told him quietly. "You built it. I only owned the dirt. But Damon, that was always the whole lesson, and you never once learned it. In the end, the man who owns the dirt owns the building. It doesn't matter how beautiful the thing you build is, if you build it on ground that belongs to someone you've decided to look down on. You spent 11 years standing on my floor to make yourself taller. You should have spent one afternoon reading page 9. He left my house a different man than the one who'd knocked. I watched him get back into his car and sit there for a long time, hands on the wheel, not moving, and I recognized the posture because it was mine in his parking garage weeks before. The posture of a person whose whole understanding of their situation has just come apart. I did not enjoy it. I want to tell you I did. I think you might respect me more if I told you I stood at my window and savored it, but I didn't. I felt the grief again. For the pier, for the candlelight, for the boy who was already gone. And then I went to check on the trust for Ellie, because grief is not a reason to stop protecting the people you love. The collapse, when it came fast. This is what people who have never held real leverage do not understand about power. Its use is quiet and its effects are loud. I did nothing dramatic. I sent letters. I signed my name where Harold told me to sign. And the machine did the rest, the way a demolition is really just gravity, invited. The investment firm walked away from the deal and, worse for Damon, quietly reported what they'd found in his offering documents to the people whose job it is to care about such things. The primary lender called the loans. Without the credit lines, the second restaurant couldn't make payroll. The boutique hotel's mortgage went into default. The vendors, who always know before anyone, stopped extending terms. And the Crescent Room, the Jewel, the pier, the candlelight on the black water, closed its doors 90 days after Harold hand-delivered a plain white envelope, and the sign came down, and the building sat dark and mine at the end of its pier. I watched it happen from a distance, the way you watch weather. I did not gloat and I did not intervene. I had set the one stone that mattered, and the rest was only gravity doing what gravity does. The second restaurant closed first, quietly, a paper notice taped to the door on a Tuesday. Then the boutique hotel, which had never really made money and had only ever floated on the credit the flagship secured, went into default, and a management company took it over for the lender. Damon laid off staff in waves, good people, cooks and servers, and a front desk woman with 2 kids. And this is the part one do carry, because they did nothing wrong and they paid for his sins along with him. I did what I could, quietly, through Harbor Point. More than one of those cooks works in Grace's kitchen now, and the front desk woman runs the events calendar. And none of them know that the old man who eats at the corner table is the reason they lost the old job and found the better one. Some debts you pay without ever letting the other person know they were owed. Sabrina left him 3 weeks before the flagship closed. Of course she did. She had never loved Damon. She had loved the version of Damon that the money projected onto the wall, and when the money went, the projection went with it, and there was only Damon left, and Damon alone was not a thing she had ever signed up for. I heard, through the small channels of a small city, that she went back to the investment firm as if nothing had happened, and that she was the one who first flagged the irregularities in his offering documents to the partners, turning on him the instant it served her, which tells you everything about the kind of woman a man leaves his family for. Damon, who had thrown away a wife who loved him for a woman who loved his balance sheet, ended up with neither. There is a justice in that so clean I could not have designed it if I tried, and I want to be clear that I did not design it. I only pulled one stone. The man's own choices did all the rest. Diane Osei called me herself near the end. I never learned exactly how she'd found her way to me. Sharp people find sharp people. She said only, "I recognized you at that dinner." I don't know how, but I did. I knew the loud one at the head of the table was nothing, and the quiet one at the foot was everything. She paused. Then she said, "For what it's worth, Mr. Mercer, we walked away because of what he'd done. Not because of what you did. You didn't ruin him. You just stopped protecting him from himself." I thanked her. I have thought about that sentence many times since. I am still not sure it lets me off the hook. But it is close to the truth, and the truth is usually the most any of us can hope to hold. Now I have to tell you about Grace, because a story about protecting your daughter that forgets your daughter is just a story about revenge, and this was never really about revenge. It was about a promise I made to a sleeping baby in a hospital hallway 6 years before. I told Grace everything myself. I would not let her learn it from lawyers or from Damon's version. I drove to their house, the house mortgaged to the ceiling, and I sat my daughter down at her own kitchen table, and I told her all of it, in order, gently, holding nothing back and rushing nothing. The phone call I'd overheard. Aspen. The LLC. The woman. The words he'd used about her. And then the other half, the half she never knew. That the sweetheart lease had been me. That the family money had been me. That her whole adult life she'd been standing, without knowing it, on ground her father had quietly poured beneath her feet. I watched my daughter's face travel the whole distance I'd traveled in that parking garage. From disbelief through horror to a grief so total I had to look away. And then, when it had all landed, she did the thing that told me she was still my Grace, still Eleanor's Grace, still whole under 11 years of being made small. She did not ask about the money. She asked, "Is Ellie safe?" And I said, "Ellie has been safe since the day she was born. I made her a promise. I've kept it. There's a trust. There's a home in your name, free and clear, that he can never touch. There is a floor under you, sweetheart, that there has always been, and always will be, for as long as I draw breath and long after. You were never as alone as he taught you to feel." And my daughter, 40 years old, put her head down on her own kitchen table and cried the way she cried as a little girl, and I sat beside her with my hand on her back, and I did not say another word, because some moments do not want words. They just want a father who stayed. The weeks after that were the hardest and the most beautiful of the whole affair. Harder than the letters, harder than the confrontation, because watching someone you love come back to themselves is a slow thing, and you cannot rush it and you cannot do it for them. At first Grace was angry at me, and I let her be. She said I should have told her years ago what I had, what he was. She said I'd treated her like a child, moving pieces around her without her knowledge. And she was right, partly, and I told her so, and I did not defend myself, because a man who protects his daughter and then demands she be grateful for it was only ever protecting his own pride. But then, slowly, as the shock wore off and the truth of the phone call settled into her, as she read the LLC documents and saw the Aspen deed and understood that the man she'd made herself small for had been planning her disposal the whole time, The anger turned where it belonged. And under the anger, something I had not seen in 11 years began to come back. Her volume, her stubbornness, the funny, fierce, unafraid girl Eleanor and I had raised, buried alive for a decade under a man's need to feel large, started clawing her way back up into the light that I will tell you the moment I knew she was going to be all right. It was maybe 2 months after the flagship closed. We were at my kitchen table and she was telling me some story about Ellie's school. And in the middle of it she laughed, a real laugh, loud and unguarded, a laugh with her whole body in it, a laugh I had not heard since before she married him. And she caught herself out of 11 years of habit and started to shrink it, to fold it back up and put it away the way she'd been trained to. And then she stopped. I watched her stop. I watched my daughter make a decision right there at my table. Watched her decide that she was allowed to take up the whole room with her own laughter in her own father's house. And she let it out again, louder, and she looked at me with tears standing in her eyes and she said, "God, Dad, I forgot I sounded like that." And I said, "I didn't. I've been waiting 11 years to hear it again." And we sat in my small kitchen and laughed together until we both were crying, and Eleanor was there, I promise you she was there, in the third chair where the light comes in. Damon did not go to prison, in case you are wondering, though it was closer than he ever knew. The fraud in the offering documents was real, but proving intent is hard, and the investment firm, wanting no publicity, chose to simply vanish rather than prosecute. So he did not get bars. He got something that, for a man like Damon, may be worse. He got smallness. The divorce, when it came, was not the clean break he'd planned with everything hidden in an LLC. It was a public unwinding of an insolvent estate, and Grace, standing on the solid ground I'd poured, needed nothing from him and asked for nothing, which humiliated him more than any demand could have. The Aspen property was seized by creditors before he could hide behind it. The woman, the one from the phone call, disappeared the way such women do when the money does. And Damon Kessler, who once stood on a pier and saw candlelight, took a job managing a chain restaurant 2 towns over, the kind with plastic menus and a name you'd forget, and I am told he is good at it, actually, and that some nights he stands at the host stand and watches other people's celebrations and remembers when the whole coast drove 2 hours for his table. I take no pleasure in that image. But I do not look away from it either. The Crescent Room sat dark for almost a year. And then I did something that surprised even Harold. I gave it to Grace. Not least. Gave. Deeded, free and clear, to my daughter, the building her father had bought when it was a ruin. The building her husband had built a life on and lost. She reopened it last spring under a new name with her own hands and her own vision. And it is not the same place Damon built, and it is better, warmer. A place where the staff are paid fairly and the old man who carved a wooden bird eats at the best table in the house. Not the broken chair at the end. Candlelight still dances on the black water of the harbor. People still drive 2 hours. The night she reopened, she named it. She never told me what she was going to call it. She wanted it to be a surprise, and I did not push, because a father who has spent a year quietly moving mountains ought to know how to let his daughter keep one secret. I came on opening night in my good cardigan, the same one, and Grace met me at the door with Ellie on her hip, and she turned me by the shoulders to face the new sign above the entrance, glowing warm against the dark water. It read, in simple letters, Eleanor's. My wife's name, up in light over the harbor, over the building I'd bought for love and lost to greed and won back for my daughter. I did not say anything for a while. Couldn't. Grace put her free hand on my arm and said, quietly, so only I could hear it. You gave me a floor to stand on my whole life, Dad, and I never even knew it was there. I wanted her name to be the thing holding up the roof, so everybody who ever eats here is standing on her too. On both of you. An old man does not often get to see the shape of his whole life reflected back at him in a single evening. I got to that night. I stood under Eleanor's name with my granddaughter reaching for my collar and my daughter's hand on my arm. And I understood that everything, the 30 quiet years, the promises at 2 graves, the long patience, the terrible cold clarity of what I'd had to do, all of it had been leading to this one warm room full of light. It was worth it. Whatever it cost me, and it cost me more than I've told you, it was worth it. I saw Damon one more time about 6 months after that. I hadn't gone looking for him. I want to be clear about that. I was driving back from visiting a property 2 towns over, and I stopped at one of those chain restaurants off the highway, the kind with the plastic menus and the laminated specials, because I was tired and it was there. And I walked in, and there he was at the host stand in a manager's cheap blazer with the restaurant's logo on the breast. Damon Kessler, who once had the whole coast driving 2 hours for his table, standing at a podium asking travelers whether they wanted a booth or a table. He saw me. I saw him see me. And for a terrible second, the whole thing hung there between us, 11 years and one phone call and a plain white envelope, all of it in a fluorescent-lit chain restaurant off the highway. I thought he might say something cruel or something broken or nothing at all. What he did surprised me. He looked at me for a long moment, and something moved across his face that I had not seen there in a decade. Something that might, in a better man, have been the beginning of understanding. And he said, very quietly, "How's Ellie?" Not Grace. He knew he'd lost the right to ask about Grace. He asked about his daughter. And I told him the truth, that she was wonderful, that she was happy, that she was loved. He nodded, and his jaw worked, and he said, "Good, that's good." And then a family came in behind me wanting a table for 5, and Damon Kessler put on his host's smile and turned to seat them, and I took my leave, and I have not seen him since. I do not know if he is a better man now than he was. I hope, for his sake and for the small part of Ellie that will always be his, that he is becoming one. Loss does that to some men. It broke my brother Thomas. Maybe it will build something in Damon. I have decided that is between him and God, and no longer any business of mine. Here is what I have learned, and it is the only thing I have to give you at the end of this. The world is full of loud men at the heads of tables, men who mistake the fact that no one has yet moved the floor beneath them for proof that they are standing on their own strength. And the world is full of quiet people at the ends of tables, people easy to overlook, people who have been underestimated so long they have made an art of it. Do not measure a person by where they are seated. Do not measure them by the wine they bring or the elbows of their cardigan. The person who says the least at the table is very often the one holding it up. And I will tell you something else, something it took me 65 years and the loss of nearly everyone I've loved to understand. The loudest cruelty in the world is almost always a form of fear. Damon did not toast my poverty to that table full of strangers because he was strong. He did it because somewhere underneath the gold letterhead he knew, he had always known, that he was standing on ground he did not own, and a man who knows in his bones that the floor is not really his will humiliate anyone to keep from having to feel it move. The people who need to make you small are the ones most terrified of their own smallness. I have never once in my life met a genuinely powerful man who needed to prove it at another man's expense. Real strength has nothing to prove. It buys the building and holds the lease and says nothing and waits and loves the people it's protecting and only ever shows itself on the one day it's finally needed. If a person is loud about their power, it is because they are borrowing it. And everything borrowed in the end gets called in. My granddaughter Ellie is 7 now, and on Sunday evenings she does her homework at a corner table at Eleanor's while her mother runs the room, and she keeps the little carved wooden bird I made her on the windowsill by the register where she can see it while she works. She is loud, that child. She takes up the whole room. Nobody has ever taught her to fold herself small, and God is my witness, nobody ever will, because that is what the trust is for, and the deed, and the 30 quiet years, and everything a grandfather can build like a wall between a child and the cold. And if you are one of those quiet ones, if you have spent a lifetime being toasted for your smallness by people who have no idea what you carry, I want you to hear an old man tell you this: your patience is not weakness. Your silence is not surrender. Sometimes the quiet at the end of the table is simply a man waiting, with perfect stillness, for the moment he is finally asked to show what he has been holding all along. I still live in the brick house on Linden Street. I still drive the weak tea sedan, and I still fix 2 cups of coffee some mornings before I remember. The crooked porch step is still crooked. I fixed the wobbly chair, though. I brought it home from the penthouse when the estate was liquidated, the very chair they sat me in, and I fixed its broken leg at my kitchen table on a quiet evening, and now it sits at the head of my own table, where my granddaughter sits when she comes for Sunday lunch. She doesn't know what it is. To her, it's just Grandpa's good chair. But I know what it is. It is a reminder that they can put you at the end of the table in the broken seat and laugh, and it changes nothing about who is holding up the room. You just have to be willing to wait. And you have to make very, very sure that before you move the floor, everyone you love is already standing safely on solid ground. So let me leave you with the question I've carried, and let me ask it plainly, because I think about it every time I sit in that mended chair. If someone spent years making you small, teaching the people you love to laugh at you, planning quietly to throw away someone you die to protect, and then one day the whole of their world was placed into your hands, to save or to end with a single quiet signature, what would you do? Would you show them the mercy they never showed you? Or would you finally, calmly, stop holding up their floor? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where your line is, and tell me your own story, if you have one, of the moment you were underestimated and chose to wait. I read every one, because I know, better than most, that the quietest person in the room is almost never the smallest. Very often, they are simply the one who owns the ground. My name is Walter Mercer. I am 65 years old. They sat me at the end of the table in the broken chair, and they laughed. And I let them, because I already knew how the evening would end. I had known for 11 years. I was only ever waiting to be asked to stand.